They have no idea where we are, who we are, where we're coming from, or who we are, where we're coming from, or who we are, where we're coming from, or who we are, where we're coming from. Hey! And this is the best of the best. Wow. That is football.
Welcome again. Welcome back to the Chop Shop. It's been a long time. It's been an eventful off season, and right now, all of the people that we love are out running around in spandex. It is my personal favorite time of the year. It's Combine Week, and we have Josh Larky on the show this week to talk semantics. I think that's what we're going to dive into a little bit. But Josh, I know who you are. Jeff knows who you are, but a lot of our readers might not. They should.
Well, first off, Ronnie, Jeff, thanks for having me. So I'm Josh Larky. You can find me on Twitter at JLarkyTweets. All of my content, all of my team's content is on the33rdteam.com. So this is my day job, my night job. I essentially strategize how we at the 33rd team are going to handle any type of gambling content, whether it's fantasy, betting, dynasty, DFS, all of that. So I hire people that are smarter than me and that are better at different individual parts of fantasy or betting. And I think we have a pretty good product out there. And right now it's all free on the 33rdteam.com.
Jeff, you're the one that turned me on to 33rd 12, 16 months ago and told me a little bit about what they were doing. And of course, we had a guy that we knew in-house who now works with y'all. Mm-hmm. And it's been fun to watch it grow. But Jeff, comments real quick about Josh, 33rd, and why people should actually pay attention to it. Because Josh, you sold it a little bit, but like you have the coolest job in the fantasy business. I'm gonna be real. Like I'm super jealous of what you get to do every day. So Jeff, you want to sell it a little bit more?
Okay, so here's I guess I don't say the elevator pitch, but 33rd Team is the only place you can go for football and fantasy related information that comes from NFL decision makers. It comes from real analysts. You've got the hard facts, the hard numbers, hard data, and then you've got content that rolls out from NFL wide receivers, NFL running backs, NFL quarterbacks, NFL decision makers. These are people that have been in those rooms. It's not some guy sitting in his mom's basement telling you about, well, the Giants should do ... These are real people who have been in the room. They're going to guide you on how these roster builds are going to come together, and that's what's going to impact your fantasy team.
Well, yeah, I guess if we want to take it there. So my boss is Joe. I was going to say my boss is Joe Banner, for anyone that follows football, a former president of the Eagles. So that's kind of the type of structure we have. Just to kind of add on to that is we're really trying to be holistic with football. And I've always felt that the best people at betting on football, playing fantasy with football, are ones who actually understand the game and the types of decisions that are being made up top. So I think that's what we kind of do as like the unique value add, is trying to synthesize and bring together those two worlds of football and then gambling.
Well, I love it. And you guys, if you're watching this show, you know Jeff and I's links, but for Josh's, throw them up on the screen here. Go click them. 33rd, you can follow them there as well. And let's move on. All right, so terminology. We wanted to have Josh on specifically to talk about the words that people are using, whether it's amateur analyst or like professional people on SiriusXM and everywhere in between. The terminology that we use when we evaluate and give advice regarding fantasy football players. And this time of the year, that comes in the form of prospect evaluation, rookie evaluation, and mostly in the form of dynasty advice. There's been a lot of talk recently about a certain prospect, which we'll dive into in a second. And people have been throwing around the word generational. And Jeff and I realized that we perceive it in a way that is different than someone like Josh might perceive it. And we wanted to just talk really quickly about how that then affects the players and the people who pay us for advice, like their actual strategies and their chances of success when they implement the advice that we give them. Definitions wise, we want to talk about the word generational, right? Look at like Bijan Robinson, for example. Wikipedia will say the average period is generally considered to be about 20 to 30 years during which children are born, blah, 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 blah. 20 to 30 years is the important takeaway there. That's a long time. And if you are on Twitter and you don't know anything about context and you see Josh Larky say this prospect is generational, you might walk away and think, I need to go spend everything I have to get that guy because he's going to be the best player in 30 years. That is the core of why we want to discuss what this means to Josh, what it means to us, and maybe land on a kind of an agreement on where it should go.
So first off, this is why I really wanted to come on the show. Is I had never been asked to break that down. I thought it was a really interesting question, Ronnie, when you were like, okay, how do you define generational? And I had to think about it for a second and think about how liberally I use it and how I use it. And essentially, when I say a prospect is generational, they're significantly better than the top prospect at that position for a given year. And what I mean by that is if I say Bijan Robinson is a generational prospect, he is the RB1 of this class. He is a much better RB1 than most years. And you might say like, oh, like when was the last prospect that might've been as good as him? And I'd say, oh, that would be Saquon Barkley. And say, oh, that's only a few years ago. That's not the 25-year period. Yes, I am not using a 25-year period for the generational. It is purely that someone like a Saquon Barkley, someone like a Bijan is such a valuable RB1. They are significantly better. I'll give another example. Everyone talked about how Trevor Lawrence was a generational talent, a generational prospect. I agree. He checked pretty much every box. And yet, not this year, but next year, 2024, we will have Caleb Williams, who could very well be a better prospect as a quarterback than Trevor Lawrence. That does not mean that Trevor Lawrence is no longer generational. What that means is that a Lawrence, a Caleb Williams, is so much better than who's the QB1 in the class this year? Bryce Young? Are you kidding me? You think Bryce Young is anything remotely close to Trevor Lawrence or Caleb Williams as a prospect? Absolutely not. And that is where generational comes in, is to let people know that, hey, yes, this is the QB1, but not all QB1s are created equal. And I think case in point is some people out there are probably shouting through their phone at me like, Bryce Young's not the QB1. What are you talking about? I'm like, that's totally fine. And that proves my point. It could be Stroud. It could be Richardson. Right. Some 33rd team, some of our scouts think it's Levis. This is all totally valid. And the reason for that is because none of these guys look significantly better than the others. And I don't think it would surprise any of us if any of those four ended up being the best quarterback from this class. It was going to be shocking if Lawrence wasn't the best quarterback from that class. It's now looking, after the Urban Meyer saga, that he will in fact be the best quarterback of this class. I think Caleb Williams can be the same thing. There might be other good quarterbacks out there. I think you'd be absolutely crazy to think there's another quarterback better than him. Just like in this class, I love Jahmyr Gibbs. Is Jahmyr Gibbs better than Bijan as a prospect? Absolutely not. Jahmyr Gibbs would be the RB1 some years, and he would be a fine RB1 in a class. But you would not say this is generational. We don't see a running back like Gibbs every year. Yeah, most years we see a running back about as good as Gibbs. We almost never see a running back as good as Bijan.
Well, I love that. One quick clarification. So your default then is like, if I say a guy is generational, I mean that in relation to the discrepancy between him and the other guys in his class, or him and the typical top guy in a class, is so big that he is an anomaly. Therefore, he's a generational prospect. Something like that.
Yes. And I also like that there's some vagueness there. I think that's important because I think ultimately how am I going to describe how good Bijan is? I think what generational does is it almost forces people to have to do the research themselves or to have to look at it themselves. And that we are all going to form different opinions of just how good Bijan is. But we all know he's RB1 in the class. And I think that's kind of an important thing, is like, it just sort of shows that like you need to do more. You need to research more. You need to look into this guy more, because he's honestly tough to quantify, because how much better is he than the typical RB1 in a class? We know it's much more, but how much more? And I think that's where the discussion comes in. But it seems like there's consensus that if this guy's just so far and away the best running back by a mile, and he'd be the RB1 in almost every other class, there we go. I'm ready to say this is a generational prospect.
Jeff, what are your thoughts with that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things that I caught in there was the kind of the vagueness, right? So when we think about how positional generations work, quarterbacks can play 15, 20 years, right? Even the mediocre ones. Running backs play 10 years. I try to look at the typical year, but it's also hard to figure out when you look at a generational back, who are you comparing him to? Okay, you can compare him to his peers, but if he's so far ahead of those guys, or if he just doesn't match I can't compare Bijan to Saquon directly or Saquon to Jonathan Taylor directly. Like, who's his best comp, right? If I look back and I say, well, LaDainian Tomlinson is his best comp, and I'm reaching back 20 years, I have to start saying, well, LT's a Hall of Fame caliber player. This guy's film checks out, his analytics check out, and this is the comp on a Hall of Fame level player. To me, I have to say, yes, he's generational, right? But I always try to set parameters to things because I'm very rule governed. I'm a man who likes rules. So if I look at the last 10 years and I say, okay, we've got Bijan Robinson, everyone's calling him generational. I see Saquon Barkley as probably the only real guy that competes. And I have to wonder, is he better than Saquon? And I don't have the answer to that question, right? Like, I'm looking at this and I say, okay, well, Saquon came out and caught 91 balls his rookie year. He was automatically a top 5 pick in rookie drafts, or automatically a top 5 pick in redraft even. I don't know how to quantify this myself, right? My idea of generational is, I guess I'm just looking at a given 10-year window for a running back. And I say, okay, well, does the skill set jive? Is he so much better at receiving, so much better at rushing, so much better at every other aspect of the game that puts him above and beyond even the best players in the game? And to me, that's what makes that generational player at any given position. But the vagueness comes in. You're saying, all right, well, the game changes so radically every 5 to 7 years. If we look at the game in 2023 compared to what it was in 2013 and then in 2003, it is 3 very different NFL football games. And so it's almost like the definition of generational needs to change with the generations, right? And you had brought up, hey, we have Trevor Lawrence and with Caleb Williams is coming. I'm old enough to remember scouting guys like Andrew Luck, Drew Brees. Like, I remember seeing those guys play and really trying to grind out what I could and be able to pull whatever video I could find, right? In 1998, watching Peyton Manning, I was about to be in high school. Like, I was a kid. So it was whatever was live on TV, right? I had it on VHS tapes. It was ridiculous. And you start trying to figure out, well, what are you looking for? Caleb Williams and guys like Anthony Richardson, they're changing the game. Does it make them generational? Yeah. I don't know. Maybe that's the new definition. Maybe generational means they have to change the position fundamentally, and that's what's changing the generation. Now we have to live up to that. I don't know what these answers are. I'm just spitballing all these ideas, and it's all this has been bebopping around in my brain for a good several months now as everyone's been selling the farm for Bijan Robinson. And for fantasy, I struggled to get behind selling 3 or 4 starters and a couple of draft picks for one player unless he's going to bring you a title now. Like, right. All of that,
and then that becomes like
know.
Strategic context, right? And that could be Bijan. It could be any draft class. The best guy, the second best guy. Where do you want to sit? Where does your team stand? The dynasty. That's why I love it. There is no distinct parameter. You have to have your own tune that you sing and the own melody that you kind of play by. Couple other side feelers about generational that I got from other people on Twitter. A few people spoke of the life cycle by position. So for generational with running back, they were like, as long as he's the best guy in a typical lifespan of a generation for a running back, so that's 4 to 6 years. If he's the best guy in the past half decade, he's generational. Wide receiver is different, blah, blah, blah. I had also seen somebody brought up, well, are you talking about the difference between like once in a generation versus generational? I thought that was a really good point. If we were to look at like Josh's definition, I think is very apt. It's just like in relation to the position, how much of an anomaly is this guy? Jeff, you're looking at a lot of different things, like the context of the position, the game, typical Jeff DiMatteo way to like, all right, well, let me just analyze all the pieces here. and then I speak, I think, on behalf of like people who don't know what they're talking about, not because I don't, but when I put myself in the shoe of like my brother who doesn't read anything other than the headlines and that's how he does his research, I have seen him make decisions in the past because people were using inflammatory words in their advice, and it bit him because he didn't know any better. So question is there a delta or a North Star that we can head towards with a word like generational when we're going through prospect evaluation and then trying to convey that to the masses?
Well, I think the hard part about having like that North Star is kind of like what we've talked about, where the game looks different than it did 10 years ago, and that looked different than it did 10 years before that. So I'll give my stance on Bijan. I think that will help answer this question in terms of why it's difficult.
Great. Bijan
could very well be the best running back prospect since LT. I'm here for that conversation. I think that shows how good he is. I'd hear that argument And I wouldn't think, oh, you are absolutely crazy for thinking that. However, I do think it's pretty crazy that in this day and age, when the running back position is devalued in real life, when it is devalued in fantasy, these running backs are getting hurt at astronomical rates. Very few teams are letting their running backs have full workloads. We literally saw it with Najee Harris. He had the massive workload, and then what did they do the next year? They said, wow, we never want him to have anywhere close to that again. It's pretty much just been Derrick Henry that truly gets 25 touches a game no matter what. That is not how these running backs are handled. I think trading out of the 101 is the smartest thing that you can do. Bijan might make me eat my words, but I think what is most likely is if we are seeing that the current climate is devaluing running backs in the NFL, the current fantasy climate is devaluing running backs, the lifespan of running backs is going way down. They are getting fewer touches. More and more, we are seeing that wide receiver ones are often outscoring RB ones in fantasy. That didn't used to happen. It almost feels like we have a perfect storm where we have fully moved away from the running back position, and then this elite generational running back prospect shows up in Bijan. And I think you'd be best served to kind of get rid of that pick. And I think when you do that in this life cycle, I'm open to hearing that his value is at a peak now. I'm open to hearing that his value will be at a peak post NFL draft. I think it also kind of depends on landing spot, but
yes,
I think that's actually a great case study in terms of how it's hard to find a North Star because of all this context. And that even if I think Bijan is the best running back prospect of the past 20 years, that doesn't mean that we can assign a value to it, because the value that we would have assigned to Bijan 5 years ago would have been much higher than it is today. So I think that's really difficult, is contextualizing how his value is going to age basically year over year. And we literally just saw it with Breece Hall, where Breece Hall's so incredible, and then he tears his ACL. This is an outcome that is becoming increasingly more common with running backs. Trevante Williams is awesome, and then he has the ACL and the MCL, and I think the PCL as well. So we're just seeing that so much more often with these running backs. The injuries or a Najee Harris situation where the team goes, they just shouldn't have this much of a workload. So that's why I think the North Star is difficult, is because there's just so much context. And I think Bijan's kind of the ultimate test for that.
I agree. You want to sell right now, and that's just because his price is so high. We said on the phone the other day, Jeff, we were talking, and I think the remark was the problem with Bijan right now is that unless he is literally everything as advertised and is nothing less, you are losing value, and you trade for essentially a best case scenario, which hardly ever happens. But Jeff, go ahead.
Well, Josh hit it on the head when he talked about things like the running back workload. I do a little bit of work on running back workload and when guys are going to crash. And, I just, the LT comp is there. Is Bijan going to be great? Yes, he is. Does it make sense to trade the 101? 100%. It's almost like you've been living inside my brain, because these are all the same thoughts I've been having for just weeks and weeks and weeks now. And I'm thinking about this, and I shared this with a few people that I know, obviously, that play fantasy. All of us fantasy players all hang out together, right? And I can't tell you how many times I was laughed out of the room for saying that if I had the 101, I wouldn't be drafting Bijan. I would be auctioning that pick off to the highest bidder. And everybody said, no, because you'd need to get this astronomical haul. And all I could think of is, if your team's garbage and you're picking at the 101, is Bijan going to be the difference between you picking first next year and a championship? Probably not. I'd rather get 5 or 6 pieces I can build and build that roster with and continue to grow my roster.
Well, yeah, if you're rebuilding with Bijan, his value in Dynasty just objectively will probably be highest next year, assuming he has a good rookie season. It seems like these year 2 running backs, generally that's when their Dynasty value is going to pop the most, if they have the good rookie season. Okay, so you're hoping that you do a skinny rebuild. You basically have a 1-year window now where you're going to be able to keep Bijan at high value and try and compete with him. Or maybe then in a year you decide to sell him. It's all kind of looking at like you're basically stuck in this 1 year of having to make the optimal decision. And I don't like having to do that. And I think like the upside of making that correct decision and selling it as peak, the peak, whatever that is probably pretty similar to what it is right now. However, the downside, if he gets injured, if he just isn't quite as good as we expected at the NFL level, something weird happens. Maybe he goes, what if he goes to the Ravens and they keep Lamar Jackson? And it turns out that Bijan is an animal. He's averaging 6.5 yards per carry, but he's not catching a lot of passes. And in fantasy, he's Derrick Henry. Then what do you do? It just seems to me like there's so many downsides, and the upside as well. We already have this peak that's probably at least like 85 to 90% of his current, like his potential future ultra peak value. So I think that's kind of why he makes for the great sell, is there's so many downsides and the upside is almost entirely baked in at this point.
Yeah, the hype machine's out.
Hey everyone. We had some technical difficulties with the end of the video there, but I wanted to do this quick outro on my own because there's actually 8 more minutes of content with Josh Larky where he gives really intimate and honest advice about like where he came from and what he was able to do and the strategies he was able to take hold of that propelled him forward within this industry. It was advice that was directly for people like myself, the smaller side of the industry, people who are trying to still make it. And I encourage you guys to come and check that out. It'll be up later this week. Until then, thank you for watching. Keep in mind what you're saying. If you're giving advice, think about the words you're using and follow Josh on Twitter. It's at JLarkyTweets. We'll be back later with some positional previews for this entire rookie class. And until then, I'm Ronnie, Jeff, Josh, Gridiron Ratings, 33rd team. Thank you. We'll be back with that extra clip later this week.
They have no idea where we are, who we are, where we're coming from, or who we are, where we're coming from, or who we are, where we're coming from, or who we are, where we're coming from.
Hey!
And this is the best of the best. Wow. That is football.